தமிழரின் பிம்பம் உங்கள் டிவி.
Welcome to CrossRoads on TVI. I'm your host, Manjula Salvaraja. A week ago, representatives of the member nations of the Commonwealth assembled in Sri Lanka for CHOGM, an acronym for the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. It was not a quiet affair, actually quite the opposite. Today we will speak about the very differing reactions of member countries at the meeting, media freedom in Sri Lanka, the impact of the meeting on human rights issues, and of course, what happens next. Let's meet our first guest. Bob Dietz is with the Committee to Protect Journalists, also known as CPJ. He's the coordinator of CPJ's Asia program and has reported across the continent for news outlets such as CNN and Asiaweek. He has led numerous CPJ missions, including ones to Afghanistan, Pakistan, the Philippines, and Sri Lanka, and joins us via Skype from New Jersey. Thank you for being here, sir.
Thank you, Manjula.
So let me, perhaps just to get our audiences, I'm sure half our audience is already familiar with CPJ, but perhaps you can let us know about the work that you do in Asia and what your organization does in Asia.
Well, we do it worldwide, and I'm responsible for the Asia program, but basically what we try and do is do what our name suggests, and that is protect journalists. We tend to operate on a case-based level, and we focus on individual journalists with individual problems. But increasingly, we've been taking on broader issues like freedom of speech and journalist safety. And as you were saying, in CHOGM, we decided we would go head-to-head with the government around media issues and try and bring it to the attention of all the members of the Commonwealth.
Now, there must have been some stats on journalists that are in exile or killed in that country that led you to believe that this was an area that you needed to focus on. Can you share some of those stories or statistics with us?
Yeah, let's do the killed list first. Sri Lanka ranks 14th on our list of the world's 20 deadliest countries. It's behind countries like Afghanistan, and Iraq leads the way with 153, and that was from that terrible period during the American invasion. We count 19 journalists killed since 1992, when we started to keep serious statistics. I have to say, in terms of killed journalists in Sri Lanka, that number has leveled off. That I think what has happened since about 2009, when the government was incredibly aggressive towards journalists and journalist organizations that it didn't approve of, the government came under so much international criticism that it resorted to other tactics other than assaults, killings, assaults on facilities, threats to journalists, and those sort of things. So we haven't seen a continuation of that trajectory of journalists being killed in Sri Lanka, which is not to say that journalists have it easy in Sri Lanka. There's a tremendous amount of pressure on them, a tremendous amount level of threat and pressure from surveillance and general government statements that makes it very difficult for anyone who isn't ready to speak the government line to really survive as a journalist.
Now, there are also many journalists from that country and other Asian countries as well that go into exile from their native countries. I'd be curious to hear, and I'm sure our audience would be too, what are some of the struggles faced by journalists in exile? I mean, I'm sure there are language issues, but there must be other things as well.
Well, first of all, let's do the statistics. According to our numbers, Sri Lanka ranks 5th in the world in terms of numbers of journalists living in exile. That's behind countries like Iran and Somalia and Ethiopia. We offer journalists assistance. We have a specific program to help journalists avoid threat, to get out of dangerous situations. But frankly, as much as possible, we try and discourage people from going into exile. Our experience has been that when especially journalists who are so tied to their culture, when they leave their country, they find that all their expertise and all of their value melts away in terms of what they can do and how they can perform in their host countries. Now, I know we're speaking on to a largely Tamil audience here, and I know many people are in the same sort of situation. But for journalists, it's exceptionally hard. They just have to realize that, almost without exception, they can't continue to follow the profession that they did back at home, and that they really have to struggle to recreate themselves. And it's very difficult for many people. To that extent, when we assist journalists who are under direct threat, we'll help them leave the country at times, or help them avoid the threat somehow at home. But we try as much as possible to encourage them to return, not to plan on staying outside of their home country. And this applies not just to Sri Lanka, but to most other countries too.
That's interesting. Now, obviously, I mean, I'm guessing that a lot of these journalists, and we've heard stories here, leave because they might feel like their own lives or the lives of their families are threatened. So do you think that they leave with the realization that it's difficult to live outside the country as well?
Yes, I think so. I think many people know that. That they know that for them, they see this as their last choice, their final choice, and the decision that they have to make to ensure their own safety. What we found is that if people leave the country for a while, in very many cases, not always, but in very many cases, if they stay outside for a period of 3-6 months, they can return. They can go home, perhaps keep a lower profile for a while, and then ease back into their original role and their original profile within society. That applies in many countries. I have to say it's much more difficult in Sri Lanka, where the same government that drove them into exile remains in power, and those animosities in Sri Lanka seem to build up to a much higher level than they do in other countries. Again, as much as possible, if you're going to leave the country, plan not to stay away forever, not to change your life completely and try and get back home. But in Sri Lanka, we're finding that's really difficult for people to do.
So given all this, I mean, talk to us about the free media campaign that you did, or the media freedom campaign that you did around CHOGM.
Well, we carried out a social media campaign. We'd originally, in the run-up to CHOGM, there had been a lot of discussion outside of the country and within the country, as well as whether or not there should be a boycott of the event and whether we should join a boycott. Several human rights groups did go ahead and call for a boycott, but we didn't. The way we operate in Sri Lanka, and frankly the way we operate in most countries, is that we usually keep contact with a wide network of people. In Sri Lanka, we most likely have 10 or 15 people with whom we're in steady contact, sort of following what's happening and what's going on. And on questions like boycotts, we tend to go to them and ask them for their advice and actually follow their lead on how to handle situations like this. The very, very, very large majority of the people with whom we spoke said no boycott, do not stay away. We're already feeling isolated, and what we'd like to do is just get as many people here as possible and bring as much attention to the situation as possible. I think that happened. I don't think it might not have changed things completely in Sri Lanka, but I think for that period of CHOGM, Sri Lanka came under much closer scrutiny than it had in the past. It's we're concerned about Sri Lanka, but getting Sri Lanka in front of the world community is much more difficult in terms of these sorts of issues. For that 4, 5, 6, 7 days that Sri Lanka was in the news, I think the country's human rights record, its approach towards the media, It's all those questions stemming out of that terrible period of violence. I think all those came under scrutiny, much closer scrutiny than they would have if everyone had stayed away.
Now there was, sorry, go ahead.
For us, we played with several ideas. One, frankly, I was going to try and get there myself, and in the end, we decided not to. We knew a lot of journalists would be going, and a lot of journalists would be critical of the government and take them on aggressively, which we saw did happen. We conducted a letter writing, a petition campaign, calling on heads of government and all the people attending CHOGM to call on President Rajapaksa to investigate this series of murders over the period of his administration that have gone completely uninvestigated. That hasn't happened, and frankly, we don't expect it to happen. But we were able to get about 2.5 million people through a petition campaign to put this pressure on the government, and certainly it was noticed by the government. You know, just this morning, before I knew we were talking today, and just before I checked in with some friends and with some journalists in Sri Lanka, and I said, has there been any retribution? Has anything come down very heavy? And they said no. You know, we know the problems of Jaffna, but they said in terms of a crackdown on the media that everyone had feared, they haven't seen that happen yet. I can't help but think that the government felt that pressure to back off of its terrible attitudes towards the media. It's very foolish to claim victory in these sorts of situations because, frankly, it's a very long-term battle. But I do think that not just our campaign, but all the attention that was drawn to Sri Lanka during CHOGM made the government ease off on the pressure that it's putting on the population. I don't think the government's attitudes have changed. I don't think their policies have changed. But I do think that, at least for now, they feel that they cannot act the same way they were in the run-up to CHOGM.
Interesting, because of the media scrutiny. Now, do you think that this sort of the lens that has been shown on media freedom issues in Sri Lanka because of the CHOGM coverage, do you think long term, based on sort of precedents that you've seen in other countries, do you think that you see that being a long-term effect?
I wish. You know, when I look at Sri Lanka, I look at a government very comfortable in itself, in the way it's wielding power. I think that they are concerned about their international profile. But in the end, I think there are personalities driving the government and that won't, over the long period, change the way they do their business. I do think that continued international pressure, that continued scrutiny, will have at least a moderating effect. But I don't think that you're going to see vast changes in the government's attitude in almost any of the issues about which we're concerned about, the media issues certainly, and the issues about which your audience are concerned too. I think those are hard. I think they're fast and they're in place.
Interesting. Then,
you know,
go ahead. Sorry.
One other thing. I think what we saw at CHOGM was a very clear-cut example of an attitude towards the media that permeates many other countries as well. Sri Lanka doesn't stand alone in saying that the criticism of the way it handles its media or the way it handles any of its affairs, especially when they abut on human rights. That resistance and that defensive posture has a lot of support through many other developing countries around the world. And Sri Lanka doesn't stand alone. I think coming out of CHOGM, what we'll see is more coherence in that stand for those countries that don't feel that these human rights issues and these media freedom issues are valid or want to reject them, or who say that this is the developed world or the Western values being pressed on their societies. I think that line became just more clearly drawn this time around at this series of meetings than it has been in the past. But I do think that that line is becoming harder and harder. That the countries that do resist this sort of change, like Sri Lanka, like other developing countries, their position has become harder, faster, and they feel much more secure in it. And I think that gap between the developed countries and those people pushing Western liberal values on them, I think that gap between those two groups has grown and has become much more hard and fast.
Interesting. Okay, not exactly positive news, but
I'm sorry. I wish I could be more positive.
No, I mean, this is the truth. So let's take it. I mean, this is something that our audience would want to know too. What do you think that the average citizen who cares about media freedom in that country can do? The average citizen living outside of that country.
You could certainly put pressure on the Sri Lankan government by writing letters and speaking out about it. But I think depending on the country in which you live, and Canada is a great example, Canada's decision not to take part in CHOGM, I think, stemmed largely from the population of Sri Lankans in Canada, and that they did have a big influence on their government. And I think that is perhaps the best way to bring about to leverage the power that you have as individuals. In a representative government like Canada, your voice can be heard, and it can make your government take positions that it might otherwise avoid taking, just because it doesn't want the hassle or it doesn't want the other costs that might follow.
Great.
I think, in terms of how you're going to be most effective, that's the best path to follow. There are groups like us, CPJ, send us money, send us support, but there are many people, many groups like ours, speaking out about issues in Sri Lanka, and not just the media issues on which we focus. I think you can lend your hand, lend your support to them, lend your voice. When you see letter writing campaigns, petitions, sign on to them. It's the same as casting a ballot in an election in Canada. That your voice does get heard and it does get amplified. But I think you're in for a long haul here. I think everyone realizes it, and frankly, I don't have to tell Sri Lankans about long hauls because you've been through several now. But I do think you can get some, if not a change in policy in Sri Lanka, you can get an easement of the hostility with which they pursue those policies.
Bob, thank you so much for joining us on this very cold Sunday, I hear, in New Jersey. I appreciate that and hope to have you again on the show sometime to share your views again.
Well, Marshall, it's been a great opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll take a break now. Stay with us. You're watching Crossroads on TVI with Manjula Salvaraja. Welcome back to Crossroads on TVI. We're speaking about CHOGM, the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting that just took place in Sri Lanka. Let's meet our next guest. Sivakami Rajamanoharan is an activist based in London. She's the co-editor of the London-based news journal, The Tamil Guardian, and has been in this role for the past 2 years. She's also a former director of the Tamil Youth Organization UK and works as a medical doctor. She's joining us from Skype in London. Thank you for being here.
Hi, Angela. Thank you.
So let me start you off with talking about the boycott a CHOGM campaign. How effective was it? Do you think that campaign was a failure or a success?
Okay. I mean, first off, I'm not really sure how helpful it is to think of campaigns like this as, failure or successes. I think ultimately the Commonwealth to grant CHOGM to Sri Lanka was deeply wrong, morally wrong. And in that sense, I think taking a principled position was important. Equally, I think it was important for the town people to take a principled position. So I really don't think, particularly given our long history, and in particular what's happened in 2009, that it was ever an option for us to endorse CHOGM in Sri Lanka. Having said that, I know since particularly David Cameron's visit, there have been people who've looked back and said, maybe we got this wrong. Maybe he was right to go there and shine the spotlight, as he said, there. Even that I would actually disagree with. I think that the call to boycott CHOGM, to actually even change the venue before it was to boycott CHOGM, was precisely what led to the eventual outcome. So in that sense, Stephen Harper, the Canadian Prime Minister, his stance, if we look at other people, so the Indian stance, albeit he was very reluctant, if we look at the Chief Minister of Tamil Nadu, Jayalalitha, Mauritius, and obviously the numerous calls to boycott across, so the Canadian Tamils, British, on the homeland, and if we look at lots of NGOs, that was really important for shaping the eventual outcome. We would not be here if it wasn't for that call. And I'd actually go one step further and say, if you really look at what David Cameron did when he went there, in many ways it was a de facto boycott in the end. So he goes there. I think he arrived on the early hours of Friday morning. He leaves for Jaffna literally within hours, goes there, and it basically engages with the Tamil people. That was his principal point of engagement. Comes back, says a few words, and then he's off the next plane. So he didn't boycott, but he left before the gala dinner, for example, and left early in many sense. Again, that would not have happened. I just do not believe that would have happened if it wasn't for the sustained campaign of the last year. And even if you look at the de facto boycott, I would say that almost vindicates the boycott campaign's position, which was always to say that the engagement with Sri Lanka that's been happening till now, in terms of closed-door diplomacy and then photographs and promoting sort of achievements of development, was helpful. And I think, to be honest, his visit there proves that it's not helpful. It proves that the only thing that's going to really shine a spotlight on Sri Lanka is an almost deliberate snub, which is what happened.
So, let's talk a little bit about, there were sort of these deferring, we just touched on this, but these deferring actions from various countries. Yes. And, maybe I'll get you to speak to, were there ones that sort of disappointed you?
Yes. Actually, I'd really like to start with India. India, the Indian PM Manmohan Singh didn't actually go to Sri Lanka, but
Sivakami, sorry, I'm just going to interrupt you for a second. I think we are just have to refine the sound that we're getting from your end, because I know your interview is one that our audience has been waiting for. So we're just going to take a break, folks, and when we come back from the break, we'll have that problem fixed so we can hear her properly. Stay with us. You're watching Crossroads on TVI with Manjula Salvaraja. Welcome back to Crossroads on TVI. We had to interrupt our interview with Sivakami before because of some sound issues. I believe we have fixed that now. So we will go back to talking to her again. And the question that I had put to her was if, whether she was distinctively disappointed by the actions of certain member countries of the Commonwealth at the CHOGM meeting. Sivakami, I'll let you go ahead with your answer.
Hi, Manjula, thank you. So I was just saying before that although India didn't actually send their Manmohan Singh, the Prime Minister, in the end, I do think the Tamil people were disappointed by India's response. They were very reluctant. It's been a reluctance that's not new. So if you look at their stance when it comes to the UN Human Rights Council resolutions, there is a similar reluctance going on. It's a real shame because actually India should be leading on these issues. Just proximity, and also obviously Tamil Nadu link is there. So in terms of their internal interests as well as wider, greater interests, I would argue that it's in their interest to be taking the lead on the Tamil issue, which they consistently fail to do so. You've also got other things. So, for example, Callum McRae, the director of No no-fly zone, had his visa denied by India. Very spurious grounds as to why, and it's not clear. But nonetheless, it's slightly strange, and really they should be taking a stronger stance. The other country, I guess, we can't really not highlight would be Australia. So Australia Prime Minister Tony Abbott, when he went there, I think he was commenting about torture, and he actually said something like, we accept in difficult circumstances, difficult things happen. Quite frankly, that's not only very hurtful to the sentiments of the town people, but even on international human rights and international legal terms, really questionable stance for the Australian Prime Minister to take. At the end of the day, torture is not a difficult thing that happens, even in war. There's well-recognised international norms when it comes to war, and torture is in violation of that. I think Australia is another one where, although we're disappointed, it was far from what expected, given their previous stance, and given, I would say, what is very short-sighted thinking on their part, by playing up to a domestic audience when it comes to the boat people and other issues, when actually they should be leading on human rights concerns.
Now, who were the countries that you think that made a difference, that you think sort of, listened to the boycott CHOGM campaign and may have, altered their actions accordingly?
Yeah, I think Canada really has to be commended for its stance. It was early, it was brave, it was kind of leading on that. It didn't wait for everything to change before it decides to take its own stance. And also Mauritius. So Mauritius, when I think the key point is not just that the Premier boycotted, but it was the reason why he gave. He very clearly said, this is a principled position, I do not feel able to go there. And even when he was faced with not getting the next CHOGM, which they were due to have, he decided to continue with that principled stance and not go. In that sense, it's very significant, extremely significant. The other obvious country is the UK. So the UK's policy of engagement on Sri Lanka has been very questionable to date. So the most recent previous thing would be Alistair Burke game, where he goes and he takes photographs on the Muluwaikal beach, and he talks about closed-door diplomacy being effective, when in reality nothing has changed. In that sense, the UK's position now is welcome, in particular when David Cameron goes there and gives a very definite deadline to a independent investigation within Sri Lanka. That deadline is a good start. It really constrains Sri Lanka's ability to continuously delay what's happening. And it has raised Tamil people's expectations though, and I think that's important. So although the UK has come out with this stance and it's very welcome, it really depends what's going to happen from now to March. I think everyone's fear is that although he said this, if the Sri Lankan government was to now launch an internal inquiry, or any inquiry talking about reconciliation or truth, none of these things actually meet Tamil people's demands, which have been quite clear about accountability and justice, and quite clearly saying that we don't feel we're going to be able to get this unless it's within the framework of an international inquiry.
So let's say this independent inquiry that he's called for does not happen. Then what happens next?
Well, from the UK perspective?
From the UK perspective, yes.
So according to what he said, hopefully in March, come Geneva, then he will be calling and joining the call for an international inquiry. And I think that is very significant. The question is whether what happens from now to March, for him to backtrack on that would be deeply disappointing, and I think there would be very serious repercussions from that in terms of his support of the British Tamils here.
So give me some indication. I mean, I know that there are people that follow the UK politics very closely, but his change of heart with regards to, going to Jaffna and everything that he did, taking a media crew with him that went along too. I mean, that sort of change in behavior, what was that? What was the push to get him to that? Was it the Channel 4 videos? Was it advocacy by the organizations and the ground in the UK?
I think it's a number of things. I think internationally, the way Sri Lanka is seen and the coverage of Sri Lanka has changed. So the predominant coverage of Sri Lanka over the last few months has been things like the Channel 4 video. It's been things like Navi Pillai going to, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, like the Human Rights Council, going to Sri Lanka and coming back and saying, there's increasingly authoritarian tone. So all of these things add up to a situation where Britain's position of going to CHOGM, particularly in light of the Canadian Prime Minister saying that he was going to boycott, becomes untenable. So even domestically, the Foreign Affairs Committee is asking the Cabinet Office, why is he going? And we really should be calling for a boycott. So in that setting, I think even they had become to realise that they have to do some serious PR work to justify their position. But equally, yes, undoubtedly, there has been a sustained call from British Tamils here, so diaspora organisations in the UK, asking the Prime Minister why he's going. And even in the lead up, I think if you look at the last couple of weeks, there's been protests, there's been hunger strike on his doorstep, protests on his doorstep. I don't think we can ignore any of these things. And collectively, we get to a situation where he has to deliver. I think, unfortunately, given Britain's role in the Commonwealth, the situation of him not going, and I think it's said privately as well, was never going to happen. So we get to a point where he needs to justify his visit. And in that sense, him reaching out and engaging with the diaspora groups in the run-up, I think it was a week before he actually went, is significant. And also the fact that he goes there. And unlike previous key international figures that have gone to Sri Lanka, he puts a particular emphasis on listening to the Tamil people. So he doesn't just go there and talk about human rights. He goes to the north, goes to Jaffna. He talks to the Udayan, which is a Tamil newspaper, so making a clear distinction between that and the human rights concerns of individuals. He focuses on Tamil people in particular. And I think that is to be welcomed.
Interesting. I mean, we, perhaps because we happen to be all Tamil, we follow media a lot, and whenever something about the issue in Sri Lanka is written up, we read it. But I'm curious as to if you follow media in the UK, if you've seen any change in the coverage, whether it's the tone or the volume of coverage around this CHOGM brouhaha.
Absolutely. I mean, in terms of volume, it's been sustained. I'm not sure. I haven't been following the Canadian media so carefully, but particularly in Britain, the fact that ITV, Channel 4 and the BBC were there with the Prime Minister was significant. It's almost unprecedented. Particularly the BBC's coverage of Sri Lanka it's welcome. It's become much more sustained. So CHOGM, particularly in the last few days, the few days of when CHOGM was going on, was the key principal news story on multiple news sites, even though the whole thing in the Philippines was going on as well. So it's not as if it was a quiet news day. So in that sense, it's good. Even if you look at the tone, the focus on the Tamil collective rights it's beginning to come. And I think that's important. That's something that we should be pushing as well. Because it's very different. It's very different talking about the individual rights of people on the island as opposed to the problems that Tamil people face, and which many of the problems they face is because they're Tamil. It's not just because they're on the island. Yeah.
Interesting. So I'm going to put a final question to you. I'm curious about if David Cameron has had the support of the House, basically. I mean, I'm just curious about how the opposition parties are reacting to his call for an independent investigation, which is quite a tough stand. What's the political landscape there around this?
So, in fairness to the opposition, they were calling for a boycott before he went, and many members of the opposition were calling for an international investigation. So that has been said, and in Britain we've got a all-party parliamentary group for Tamils. And so across the board, there are key people saying that actually Sri Lanka is incapable of investigating itself. And if the Tamil people are ever going to get accountability and justice, it has to be an international process. There is just no two ways about this at all. I think, I'm not sure if the opposition expected, and I'm not even really sure whether David Cameron's party expected the visit to turn out the way it did. I think it was almost like a snowball effect. So we go from boycott campaign, he gets there, he thinks he needs to justify his response, and then this happens. I'm not sure really if they've expected that, but certainly I'm not really sure whether the opposition expected it to go as well as it did in terms of his how well received it was within the community.
Interesting. Well, thank you so much for joining us. It has been a pleasure. I know you have a busy schedule as well, especially with all the activism and the work that you do with the Tamil Guardian. And we hope to have you again on the show. Thank you, Sivakami.
Thank you very much.
We'll take a break now. Stay with us. You've been watching Crossroads on TVI with Manjula Salvaraja. Welcome back to Crossroads on TVI. We're speaking about CHOGM, the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting that just took place in Sri Lanka. Let's meet our next guest, a familiar person to people who have watched this show before. Todd Ross is the media spokesperson and director of Canadian Human Rights Voice, a group committed to the betterment of life for civilians around the world that suffer under human rights violations. They do their work by encouraging political diplomacy and utilizing mass media. Welcome to the show again.
Thank you for having me back.
So you know we were going to have this discussion post-CHOGM. It was expected because you were on our show about CHOGM. And first of all, let me start you off by asking you, was CHRV advocating for a boycott of CHOGM?
Yes, we were advocating for a boycott. We had been speaking with the federal government quite well in advance, and our early recommendation was that the Prime Minister not go to the Heads of Government meeting.
Okay. Now, there's an article that I read written by Dr. Chapnick in the Toronto Star, just with an alternate view, and you know, different papers and editorials were taking their sides, and you know, one of the things that he said is he thought that, I'm going to read a piece from what he said, is that the Harper government will be unable to alter resolutions coming out of the meeting and will lose any chance of ensuring that regimes like the one in Sri Lanka don't serve as Commonwealth hosts in the future. The point he was making in this piece is that there's a case to be made for attending these meetings to shape their outcomes. Given all that, do you think that him staying away had a larger impact than him attending? And that's Prime Minister Stephen Harper again.
Yes. So I think by the Prime Minister staying away, that did have a larger impact. We did have a representative at the meeting. We had the Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs and the Secretary of State for Human Rights, International Human Rights, who had attended on the Government of Canada's behalf. So we were at the table. And in fact, in the final resolution that came out of CHOGM, the Canadian government, there was a specific piece around climate change that was written in, and actually the Prime Minister had been speaking with the Prime Minister of Australia, who was at the summit, and came out with a recommendation in that final paper. So Canada did have an input into the summit, even though the Prime Minister wasn't there. And I think by him staying away, that what it did was it really raised the issue of human rights, which wasn't on the formal agenda. And I think with the British Prime Minister being there and for his active role at the summit and for his calls for an inquiry, I think it really played out well in that the main focus of that summit, even though it was not on the agenda, the main focus of the summit ended up being human rights in Sri Lanka.
It's interesting because that is what Sivakami, again, she's, you know, knows about what happens in the UK. She's based out of the UK, does her activism there, and writes from there as well. And she said the same thing. She felt that it actually got the ball rolling, so to say, the stand that Stephen Harper had taken. Why is it that you think that other world leaders, I mean, let's leave out the obvious ones that have multiple issues tied to them, India and UK for a second, right? Because there are constitutional issues around UK's attendance as well. Mm-hmm. Why is it that some of the other smaller countries didn't take Stephen Harper's lead, you think?
Well, you have to remember that only 27 nations participated at the summit out of 53.
That's
so
right.
A lot of people did stay away. They didn't
it's
stay away.
It's the smallest attendance so far,
yes.
apparently.
And it speaks more to the relevance of the Commonwealth than anything. And a lot of people have been speaking on the relevance of the Commonwealth. So the fact that many had stayed away, I think a lot of them didn't want to go because of the location, but there were others who said there's really nothing in it, or anything that comes out of this conference has already been decided, so having the leader go isn't really of any merit.
Were there any sort of any points or any particular member countries that you were disappointed with that you think could have taken a bigger stand here?
Definitely Australia and New Zealand. I thought that they could have taken a bigger stand. I would have hoped that more countries would have come out, and also, I mean, it's how we look at media as well. So we didn't hear as much from the smaller countries, It doesn't say that it didn't happen, just that I haven't been aware of everything that happened around. But I would have liked to have seen Australia take a strong stand, and I would have liked to have seen New Zealand take a strong stand, which they didn't do.
Now, Australia has actually taken a very different approach. If anything, it actually seems to be quite the opposite of what Canada or the UK may be doing. I have a feeling it's tied to some of the issues that they have with asylum seekers coming to their country. Could you shed some light on that?
Well, it's quite a right-wing government in Australia right now, and I think that has a lot to do with their perspective. They've been very, as you mentioned, with the refugees attempting to come to Australia. They've been very hardline on that through a few different governments, and I think it's where they've put their place in the sand. Whereas Canada, I think we've been quite effective here in speaking with. Again, we've got a right-wing government. But in having those ongoing conversations and getting them to be very upfront on the issue of human rights in Sri Lanka, so I think that's been a success here in Canada, and something that we can support maybe in Australia to help the communities there to continue to meet with the government and try and bring them over.
Yeah, and that again, this is where the politics of the country comes into play too. Mm-hmm. So what are your thoughts on what actually happened at CHOGM?
I thought it presented really well, and that was primarily the British Prime Minister coming out as he did so strong in the end and saying that we must have action by Sri Lanka, and giving that March date for action leading up to the UN human rights meeting, and with Britain as a member and several others. So I think it's set up for March being the next prominent date that we're all going to be looking to for how we can affect the United Nations. I expect that we'll see Sri Lanka doing a few minor things, but there's such resistance from the government in Sri Lanka. They're not going to, I believe, do an investigation or an independent investigation in the next few months. So I think leading into March, looking at that United Nations Human Rights Conference and how we can play a role in that, although Canada isn't an active member of it. But it's interesting that even China in recent days has come out to say...
I think this came as a shock to most
yes,
people.
Yes. And
tell us about the China statement, actually, because some people in our audience may not be...
Yes, so China is a brand new member of the United Nations Human Rights Council, and there were a lot of questions raised as China not being a model of human rights, why they would want to be on that council and what they would do. And so when asked on Sri Lanka, China came out very strong, saying that Sri Lanka needs to step up and that they have to address human rights complaints in the country, which leads to a very interesting March session with the expectation has always been that China would block anything to do with Sri Lanka.
Which is what has happened in the... Yeah.
Yes. So there's some hope there that China may become maybe not a major player, but they may not step in to block actions to have an independent international investigation on Sri Lanka. So I'm quite hopeful.
Yeah, well, I hope so, because there have been not great news to date. So,
Yes.
so what do you think the lasting impact of CHOGM will be in Sri Lanka for the Tamils that live there? Given that they now have the chairmanship of the Commonwealth, which is a significant position too,
mm-hmm.
right?
And I think on the ground in Sri Lanka, what it does is it gives the president kind of a way to say through the media that this was such a success. We had world leaders here, we had Prince Charles here, we're the head of the Commonwealth. Obviously, what we're doing is recognized around the world as the right path. So on the ground, that's what people are likely to continue to hear. So Sri Lanka on the ground, I don't think we're going to see a lot of change other than that international pressure that seems to be growing a bit for the independent investigation. Mm-hmm. So we'll see some results there, but as media have reported, and I think the Tamil Guardian had an article on this, that there has been, since the summit, there has actually been more white van disappearances, and even during the summit, there were white van disappearances. So the actions are still happening. Hopefully, what we can see is that international pressure continue to work on the ground.
Great. Well, what is the next big step for CHRV? What do you switch your, because you've been working on CHOGM for a bit. What's the next point of focus?
Yes, so we're going to set up a meeting with the with Canada's representative who went to the summit. We spoke with him prior to him leaving and requested a meeting, so we should do that. He, in media reports, he stated that when he went north to Jaffa and had met with the bishop and the leadership there, that he wanted to debrief the Canadian government on his return. So we're hoping to sit down and hear from him as well, what he saw in Sri Lanka and while he was there, and to continue to work with the Canadian government to see what influence Canada can bring to the United Nations in March.
The Human Rights Council.
Yes.
That's right. Yeah. Todd, thank you for coming back again. It's always a pleasure. You managed to always sort of sum it up so the rest of us can understand what's going on. Thank you and hope to see you again.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for joining us. You've been watching Crossroads on TVI with Manjula Salvaraja. Have a great week.
தமிழரின் பிம்பம் உங்கள் டிவி.